For decades, the world has been captivated by a singular image, a woman draped in silk and sequins, her voice as smooth as velvet, her smile a permanent fixture of Hollywood royalty. To many, Diana Ross is the undisputed Queen of Motown, a pioneer who broke racial barriers and redefined what it meant to be a global superstar. But history is rarely written in gold without a few drops of blood on the parchment. To others, she is the ultimate villain of the soul era, a woman accused of abandoning her roots, betraying her closest friends, and building a throne upon the wreckage of a sisterhood. Long before the world knew her as the silken-voiced Queen of Motown, she was simply Diane, a slender, hyperactive girl navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Brewster-Douglass housing projects. To understand the formidable woman she would become, one must first descend into the industrial heartbeat of 1950s Detroit. This was a city forged in smoke and steel, a place where the American dream wasn't a vague philosophy, but a tangible product, manufactured with sweat on relentless assembly lines. The soundtrack of these streets wasn't the polished pop of the future. It was a raw, unfiltered, and guttural rhythm and blues that vibrated through the very pavement, echoing the dual nature of a city that was both a land of opportunity and a factory of exhaustion. In the cramped confines of the projects, the architecture itself dictated a specific kind of survival. The walls were paper-thin, offering no sanctuary from the collective struggles of thousands of souls striving for more. In an environment where the physical currency of wealth was nearly non-existent, dreams became the only legal tender that didn't devalue with the rising cost of living. For Diane, growing up in the shadow of the Brewster-Douglass meant realizing that ambition was never a luxury. It was a biological necessity. The gray concrete of the housing complex acted as a predatory force. It was a landscape that sought to flatten individuality, demanding a fierce internal fire just to remain standing. The internal engine of Diane's ambition was fueled by the complex chemistry of her household. Her father, Fred Ross, was a stern former soldier who treated the family home with the rigid expectations of the barracks. He demanded a level of unwavering discipline that left little room for the typical aimlessness of childhood. From him, Diane inherited a military-grade work ethic and the understanding that order was the only defense against chaos. Complementing this was her mother Ernestine, a woman of profound quiet strength whose resilience had been tested in the most literal sense. Having survived a near-fatal bout of tuberculosis, Ernestine was a living testament to endurance. Her recovery wasn't just a family miracle. It was a master class for Diane in how to suffer in silence while maintaining the strength to reclaim one's life. In this high-pressure environment, Diane learned a lesson that would eventually dictate the trajectory of her entire career. Visibility was the only shield against the crushing weight of poverty. She observed that in the sprawling urban machinery of Detroit, to be quiet was to be forgotten, and to be forgotten was to be erased. The hyperactivity of her youth wasn't just a personality trait. It was a frantic, instinctive signal for attention in a world that favored the loud and the bold. She realized early on that to be invisible was to be consumed by the unrelenting gray concrete of the city. For Diane, the stage wasn't just a place for performance. It was the only place where the shadow of the projects could never reach her. In the cramped hallways of Detroit's Brewster-Douglass Projects, a hierarchy of talent was etched into the very pavement, and in those formative years, Diane was a footnote in her own story. The The undisputed sovereign of this concrete kingdom was Florence Ballard, a girl whose vocal cords seemed forged in the fires of gospel and the grit of the Southern blues. To hear Florence sing was to witness a force of nature. Her voice possessed a cavernous depth that didn't just demand attention, it commanded silence. She was the architect and the heartbeat of the primettes, channeling the raw, soul-shaking energy of Etta James into every rehearsal. Flanking her was Mary Wilson, the group's indispensable social anchor. If Florence was the thunder, Mary was the moonlight, possessing a sultry, mahogany-toned voice and an effortless, honeyed charm that acted as the glue, binding their disparate personalities into a cohesive unit while leaving every boy on the block breathless in her wake. The true metamorphosis began when the trio finally stood before the modest frame house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard, Berry Gordy's Hitsville, USA. Initially dismissed as too young and unpolished, the group faced a closed door, but Diane refused to hear the no. Her persistence didn't just border on obsession, it became a siege. She became a shadowy fixture in the Motown hallways, a ghost who refused to be exorcised. Taking a job as a secretary for mere pennies, she performed the most menial of tasks, fetching coffee, running errands, and answering phones with a calculated precision. Every moment spent in that building was a masterclass. From the periphery, she watched the finished products like the Marvelettes, studying the geometry of their movements and the temperature of their stage presence. Berry Gordy, a man who built an empire on the alchemy of the look and the sound, eventually looked past the clerical work and saw the feral hunger lurking in Diane's eyes. He didn't just see a young girl wanting to sing. He saw a mirror of his own relentless drive. From the darkened sanctuary of the control booth, Gordy observed her uncanny ability to mimic the stars, noting how she instinctively adjusted her posture and tone to match the requirements of the room. She was a chameleon of ambition, molding herself into whatever the Motown machine required. While the world still saw Florence as the voice of the group, Gordy began to see that Diane was the vision, a quiet, burning force fueled by a deep-seated insecurity that would eventually set the world on fire. This utility player status was not a permanent residence for Diane, but a strategic vantage point. While she meticulously engineered the group's aesthetic under that dim bedroom lamp, she was also observing the mechanics of stardom. She realized that while Florence owned the airwaves with her voice, the person who controlled the image controlled the legacy. Diane wasn't just sewing fabric. She was weaving herself into the very fabric of Motown's future identity, preparing for the moment the spotlight would finally shift. The machinery of betrayal was not built overnight. It was assembled with the cold precision of a clockmaker. While the public saw the glitz and the synchronization of hand gestures, the true dismantling of the Supremes was happening in the frequency ranges of the mixing board and the locked drawers of executive desks. To understand this selection, one must look past the music and into the demographics of 1960s America. Berry Gordy was not merely casting a lead singer, he was engineering a Trojan horse. The decision to elevate Diana Ross over Florence Ballard was an act of sonic gentrification. Florence's voice was a force of nature, a textured, heavy instrument that carried the unmistakable gravity of the Black experience. It was rich with vibrato, grounded in the diaphragm, and undeniably soulful. In any other context, this would be the pinnacle of talent. But to Gordy, whose eyes were fixed on the lucrative segregated suburbs of white America, Florence's voice was a barrier. It was too ethnic, too raw, too reminiscent of the struggles he wanted his white audience to forget. He needed a sound that could slip through the cracks of segregation without triggering the racial anxieties of the mainstream. Diana offered the acoustic solution. Her voice was technically flatter, lacking the deep, resonant bottom end of Ballard's. Critics and purists often derided it as thin or nasal, but Gordy saw this lack of weight as a supreme aerodynamic advantage. It was a frequency that cut through the low-fidelity speakers of transistor radios in white teenagers' bedrooms. It was pop-friendly, a sanitized, polished sound that carried the melody without carrying the history. By choosing Diana, Gordy wasn't just choosing a singer. He was choosing to bleach the soul out of the sound to ensure it could be sold in markets where Black people were not welcome. However, the selection was not purely commercial. It was deeply psychological. Gordy was a predator of human nature, and in Diana, he found the perfect symbiotic host. Florence Ballard was dangerous to a man like Gordy because she was whole. She knew who she was before she walked into Hitsville. Her self-worth was internal, forged in the church and the streets, making her resistant to manipulation. She could not be easily reshaped because she was already solid. Diana, conversely, was a study in frantic, nervous energy. Her ambition was a desperate attempt to fill a void of insecurity. She feared she was too skinny, her eyes were too big, her voice too small. Gordy recognized this anxiety not as a weakness, but as a control panel. He knew that a woman who doubts her own value will be infinitely more obedient to the man who validates it. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a dependent. Once the target was acquired, the grooming process began. This was a systematic reconfiguration of Diana's reality, designed to nurture a specific brand of narcissism that would serve the company's bottom line. The strategy was to create a vacuum around Diana where the oxygen came from Gordy himself. He began to whisper the gospel of exceptionalism into her ear, a constant low-level indoctrination that reshaped her memories and her loyalties. He told her that the group's harmony was an illusion and that she was the solitary sun around which the others merely revolved. The background singers were no longer her sisters or her friends. In Gordy's narrative, they were dead weight, anchors dragging her down into the mediocrity of the projects. To enforce this psychological separation, Gordy implemented a regime of physical apartheid within the group. The unity of the trio was dismantled by the architecture of privilege. It started with small, tangible wedges, a separate dressing room that was slightly larger, a limousine that arrived a few minutes earlier, a costume fitting scheduled on a different day. These were not random acts of favoritism. They were calculated signals. Gordy was teaching Diana that she was a different species from Florence and Mary. By isolating her in luxury, he severed the peer-to-peer bond that had kept the girls grounded. She could no longer commiserate with them about the grueling schedules or the unfair pay because she was no longer living the same reality. She had been promoted from friend to management's asset. This grooming culminated in a relationship dynamic that was suffocatingly absolute. Gordy positioned himself as the trifecta of her existence, the employer who controlled her financial survival, the lover who controlled her emotional fulfillment, and the father figure who guided her moral compass. This was a masterclass in establishing a trauma bond. Diana was locked in a gilded cage where her romantic partner was also the man who decided if she would be a star or a nobody. The entanglement deepened with the birth of their daughter, Rhonda, a secret that acted as the ultimate padlock on the relationship. This shared secret created an us against the world mentality. further alienating Diana from her bandmates. She could not confide in Florence or Mary about the complexities of her life because her life was now a classified operation run by the CEO. She was trapped in a loop where protecting her position meant protecting Gordy, and protecting Gordy meant destroying the Sisterhood. The final phase of this mechanism was the divide and conquer strategy, a brutal campaign of psychological warfare designed to liquidate the opposition. Gordy knew that for Diana to rise, Florence had to fall, and the fall had to look like a suicide. He began to weaponize Diana's paranoia. He planted seeds of terror, suggesting that Florence's natural charisma and vocal power were not assets to the group, but direct threats to Diana's reign. If you don't step on them, they will pull you under, was the subtext of every private meeting. He turned the stage into a battlefield where a glance or a smile from Florence was interpreted as an act of insurrection. Diana, fueled by this manufactured fear, began to view her childhood friend as a rival who needed to be neutralized. The execution of Florence Ballard was slow, public, and humiliating. Motown didn't just fire her, they dismantled her sanity. Knowing that Florence was struggling with the depression of being erased from her own creation, the company used her coping mechanisms against her. When the pain drove her to drink, the alcohol became the official reason for her discipline. When the stress and medication caused her weight to fluctuate, they branded her as lazy and unmarketable. It was a vicious, self-fulfilling prophecy. They created the pressure that broke her and then fired her for being broken. The smear campaign was clinically efficient. They painted Florence as the unstable, angry black woman, a stereotype that the white media was all too ready to consume, while polishing Diana as the quintessential professional. The ultimate stroke of violence against the collective identity came in 1967 with the renaming of the group to Diana Ross and the Supremes. This was not a marketing pivot. It was an assassination of the group's soul. The ampersand was a wall. It legally and visually codified the hierarchy that Gordy had been building in the shadows. It stripped Mary and Florence of their identity as equals and reduced them to employees of the Diana Ross brand. It was a declaration that the Supremes was no longer a band of sisters, but a backing track for a solo act. This change broke Florence's spirit completely. It was the final signal that the history of the Brewster Projects had been erased, replaced by a corporate structure where affection was transactional, loyalty was a liability, and the only thing that mattered was the spotlight on the center mic. The mechanism was complete, the sisters were gone, and only the star remained. The year 1967 did not arrive with a fanfare of celebration. It arrived with the cold metallic click of a trap door swinging open beneath the feet of a sisterhood. For the world, it was the summer of love, a season of psychedelic freedom and cultural revolution. But inside the gilded, high-pressure machinery of Motown, it was the season of the long knives. The climax of this tragedy was not a single explosive argument, but a systematic and clinical dismantling of a human soul staged against the neon predatory backdrop of Las Vegas, a city built on the very illusions that Berry Gordy had spent a decade perfecting. By this point, the machinery of betrayal was no longer a secret whisper in the hallways of Hitsville. It was a humming engine running at a lethal RPM, and its primary target was the woman who had started it all. Florence Ballard walked into the Flamingo Hotel in July 1967 as a Supreme, but she was already walking through the halls like a condemned prisoner. The psychological warfare had reached a fever pitch. In the weeks leading up to the Vegas engagement, the corporate hierarchy had treated her with a calculated indifference that bordered on the sadistic. Her microphones were turned down in the mix. Her solo lines were redistributed to Diana, and her presence in publicity photos was cropped until she was a mere peripheral blur. Sensing her own erasure, Florence had spiraled into a cycle of profound depression and self-medication, her weight fluctuating as she tried to swallow the grief of being discarded by the people she called family. When she arrived at the Flamingo, she found that the physical apartheid Gordy had established was now absolute. There was a wardrobe trunk in the dressing room that did not belong to her. It belonged to Cindy Birdsong, a replacement who had been kept in the shadows, rehearsing Florence's steps and learning Florence's harmonies in secret. The replacement was already in the building, literally prepared to step into Florence's shoes before Florence had even been told she was fired. The performance that night was a public execution disguised as a nightclub act. Florence, bloated from distress and the side effects of medication, took the stage in a state of defiant despair. She knew the end was coming, and in a moment of raw, unscripted pain, she intentionally bumped into Diana during a choreographed turn. It was a desperate, physical cry for acknowledgement, a way to force the woman at the center microphone to look her in the eye and recognize the human being she was stepping over to reach the stratosphere. But Diana, now fully molded into Gordy's imperial star, didn't flinch. She maintained the porcelain mask of the professional, her smile never wavering as she glided through the set, effectively performing the role of the survivor while Florence performed the role of the ghost. Behind the curtain, the decree was finalized. Berry Gordy didn't just fire Florence, he evicted her from her own history. Within hours, the marquee outside the Flamingo was changed. The Supremes as a collective entity died that night, replaced by a new singular hierarchy glowing in predatory neon: Diana Ross and the Supremes. That night, the ampersand ceased to be just a punctuation mark. It became a tombstone. It marked the precise moment Mary and Florence transitioned from partners to mere employees in the empire they helped build. What followed was a period of high-contrast cruelty that defied the logic of the American dream. The timeline of their lives split into two parallel universes, separated by the thin, razor-sharp veil of a Motown contract. For Diana, the removal of Florence was the removal of the final anchor. Unburdened by the collective identity of a trio, she became a corporate projectile launched into the highest reaches of the entertainment industry. Gordy began the process of her solo metamorphosis with the precision of a military operation. He wasn't just making her a singer, he was making her an institution. By 1970, the farewell concert at the Frontier Hotel was staged not as a moment of mourning for a lost sisterhood, but as a masterclass in controlled, televised emotion. Diana wept on stage, a performance of grief that felt to many like a victory lap. She was being groomed for a world of white silk, international galas, and an untouchable celebrity status where the Brewster Projects were now a distant, blurry memory viewed through the tinted, bulletproof windows of a limousine. The most jarring manifestation of this ascent was Diana's transition into Hollywood. In 1972, she starred in Lady Sings the Blues, portraying the legendary Billie Holiday. The irony was staggering and almost perverse. The woman who had been accused of sonic gentrification and bleaching the soul out of Motown was now receiving an Academy Award nomination for portraying the ultimate icon of black pain and raw, unfiltered struggle. Diana was praised for her authentic portrayal of a woman broken by the system, while the real woman broken by the system, Florence Ballard, was living just a few miles away in a different world entirely. As Diana walked the red carpets of the Oscars and the Golden Globes, draped in thousands of dollars of sequins, she was effectively hijacking the very soul and heaviness that Gordy had once told Florence was a barrier to success. The image was now complete. Diana Ross was the survivor, the pioneer, the Hollywood queen who had conquered the white mainstream by wearing the mask of black tragedy. While Diana was rehearsing her Oscar speech, Florence Ballard was fighting for the right to exist in a world that had been legally designed to forget her. The legal machinery of Motown had been weaponized to ensure that if a talent left the family, they left with nothing. Florence was pressured into signing a release that was a masterpiece of corporate malice. She was forbidden from using the name Supreme for any marketing or promotional purposes. She was a singer who was legally barred from her own legacy. Every time she tried to restart her career, she found the doors mysteriously bolted. Distribution deals for her solo recordings evaporated overnight. Radio stations were advised by Motown representatives that playing a Florence Ballard record would jeopardize their relationship with the biggest hit factory in the world. She was being systematically suffocated, not just by poverty, but by a deliberate campaign of industry-wide blacklisting. By 1971, the woman who had founded the greatest girl group in history, the voice that had once commanded silence in the streets of Detroit, was standing in a line at a welfare office. The contrast was a sickness. While Diana Ross was being celebrated as a global icon of black excellence, Florence was losing her home to foreclosure. She was forced to move back into the very project she had dreamed of escaping as a teenager, scrubbing the same concrete floors she had once thought she had left behind forever. The physical toll of this fall was catastrophic. The cavernous, soulful voice was being silenced by the weight of a broken heart and the crushing stress of being a mother who couldn't provide for her children. She was a living testament to the fact that in the world Berry Gordy built, loyalty was a liability and talent was a commodity that could be reclaimed by the company at any time. Florence wasn't just poor. She was a woman whose identity had been stolen, her face erased from the gold record she had earned, her very name turned into a cautionary tale for any other Motown artist who dared to question the CEO. The climax of this tragedy reached its final agonizing beat, not in a recording studio or a movie set, but in a quiet room at Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital. On February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard's heart simply gave out. She was only 32 years old. The official cause was coronary thrombosis, but anyone who had followed the trajectory of the Brewster-Douglass girls knew the truth. She died of the exhaustion that comes from being hunted by your own dreams. Her death sent a shock wave through the community of Detroit, a city that had watched the Supremes rise as symbols of hope, only to see the founder discarded like a used costume. The funeral became the ultimate flip-flop of imagery, a final public confrontation between the star and the Sisterhood. Outside the New Bethel Baptist Church, thousands of fans gathered in a cold Detroit wind, mourning the lost Supreme who had become a folk hero in her absence. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, judgmental silence. When Diana Ross arrived, the scene was surreal. She did not arrive as a grieving childhood friend. She arrived as a global deity, draped in black mourning clothes that looked like they had been designed for a cinematic climax. She was whisked through the crowd by a security detail, her presence radiating the very imperial aura that had once driven a wedge between the trio. As she took her seat in the front pews, The congregation watched her with a mixture of awe and resentment. When she stood up to address the crowd and attempted to hold Florence's young daughters, the optics were jarring and deeply painful. To the cameras and the national press, she was the loyal friend, the hero who had come back to pay her respects. But to those who knew the history of the Flamingo Hotel, to those who had seen the separate dressing rooms and the secret replacements, she was the ultimate war criminal of the Soul era, the woman who had held the crown while the kingdom was burned to the ground. Florence Ballard was buried in a blue velvet dress, a tragic final echo of the gowns Diane used to sew for her under a flickering bedroom lamp when they were just girls with nothing but a dream. As the dirt hit the casket, the narrative was forever sealed into the pavement of Detroit. The machinery of betrayal had completed its cycle. Diana Ross would go on to live a life of unparalleled luxury and legendary status, her name etched into the stars of Hollywood. But that legend is forever haunted by the silence of the woman who wasn't there to share it. The story of 1967 is not just a story of music or a business decision. It is a haunting investigation into the price of the American dream. It forces us to look at the woman in the sequins and ask the most uncomfortable question of all. If the path to royalty requires the systematic destruction of the person who walked beside you, is the crown worth the weight of the blood on the parchment? Why is it that in the story of the greatest sisterhood in music history, there was only ever room for one survivor? If you peel back the layers of the woman who stood on a rain-slicked stage in Central Park in 1983, you find that Diana Ross was no longer a person in the conventional sense. She had become a finely tuned biological weapon, engineered for the singular purpose of occupying the center of the frame. The year 1983 serves as the ultimate decoding period, a time when the ghosts of the Brewster Projects and the echoes of Berry Gordy's commands finally manifested in public, physical displays of a deeply ingrained, almost feral reflex. This was the year of the Motown 25 reunion and the legendary Central Park storm, two events that, when laid side by side with the blueprints of the 1960s, reveal the tragic and terrifying architecture of a programmed soul. The most jarring artifact of this era occurred during the Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever television special. It was supposed to be a moment of healing, a nostalgic gathering of the architects of the sound of young America. But when the original Supremes, Diana Ross and Mary Wilson, took the stage together, the air didn't fill with harmony. It crackled with the static of a decades-old war. As Mary Wilson stepped forward to sing the lead lines of Someday We'll Be Together, Diana Ross did something that shocked the live audience and was later edited out of the broadcast. She physically shoved Mary Wilson. This was not the petty tantrum of a diva. It was a glitch in the matrix. It was a muscle memory response, a primal reaction triggered by a perceived threat to the center mic. To grasp the weight of that shove, the narrative must cut back to the 1960s, to the darkened, sterile rehearsals inside Hitsville, USA. There, we see a younger Berry Gordy, his hand on Diana's shoulder, guiding her like a director molding a silent film star. We see him whispering the doctrine of the star in the background. He taught her that the stage was a zero-sum game. Any light that fell on someone else was light stolen from her. The choreography wasn't just about dance. It was about the geometry of power. Gordy had spent years programming Diana to believe that her survival depended on her being the solitary sun around which all other bodies were merely moons. When Mary Wilson stepped forward in 1983, she wasn't just a former friend singing a song. In Diana's subconscious, she was an intruder breaching a secured perimeter. The push was a manifestation of the Gordy reflex. It proved that even after Florence Ballard was long buried, and the group had been disbanded for over a decade, the psychological conditioning remained intact. Diana didn't have to think about moving Mary. Her body did it for her. She had been taught that the spotlight was a finite resource, and to share it was to invite the erasure she had feared since the projects. The tragedy of 1983 lies in the realization that while Diana had successfully eliminated her competition, she had also eliminated her connection to humanity. At the Motown 25 event, the other legends, the Miracles, the Temptations, the Four Tops, celebrated as brothers. They leaned on each other, sharing microphones and laughter, their bonds forged in the fires of the road. Diana stood alone, even when surrounded by people. The warmth of the ensemble performances stood in stark contrast to the cold, crystalline perfection of Diana's solo segments. The ghost of Florence Ballard hung heavy over that stage, an invisible presence that Diana refused to acknowledge. Without the powerhouse to anchor her, or the glue to bind her, Diana's performance was technically flawless, but emotionally hollow. She was performing the idea of a legend. The 1983 version of Diana Ross was a woman who had won the war, but lost the language of peace. Every gesture was a calculation, every smile a rehearsed signal of dominance. She had become the imperial star, but the empire she ruled was a landscape of one. Nowhere was this imperial conditioning more visible than during the Great Storm of Central Park in July 1983. As a massive thunderstorm rolled in, threatening to tear the stage apart and endangering hundreds of thousands of fans, Diana Ross didn't retreat. She didn't seek cover. She stood in the wind and the lashing rain, her hair matted to her face, her orange silk cape billowing like a tattered flag of war. "I'm staying," she shouted into the howling wind. "It took me a long time to get here, and I'm not going anywhere." This moment is often cited as a testament to her legendary resilience, but when viewed through the lens of the 1967 betrayal, it takes on a darker, more obsessive meaning. To Diana, the storm wasn't a weather event. It was another rival. It was nature itself trying to take her spotlight. Her refusal to leave the stage wasn't just about the fans. It was about her inability to ever let go of the center mic. She would rather be struck by lightning on stage than be safe and invisible off of it. By cross-cutting between the "I'm Staying" of 1983 and the secret grooming sessions of 1965, the narrative reveals the ultimate decoding. Diana Ross was a woman who had been convinced that her value was tied exclusively to her visibility. If she wasn't being watched, she didn't exist. This was the curse of the Brewster Projects amplified by the machinery of Motown. The villain of the soul era and the hero of the global stage were, in fact, the same prisoner. The ambition that allowed her to break racial barriers and become Hollywood royalty was the same ambition that compelled her to push her sisters into the shadows. In 1983, we see the finished product of Berry Gordy's vision, a woman who could command the weather but couldn't command a genuine moment of sisterhood. The ghosts of the past weren't haunting her, she was living inside them. The sequins and the silk were the bars of a cage she had helped build, and the push at Motown 25 was merely the sound of the door locking one last time. She was the queen, yes, but she was the queen of a kingdom where everyone else had been liquidated to ensure her throne remained undisturbed. The image of her in that orange cape battling the elements is the final distillation of her life's work. It was a performance of absolute defiance, not just against the rain, but against the fear of being forgotten. In the projects, invisibility meant being consumed by the gray concrete. At Motown, invisibility meant being relegated to the background. In Central Park, Diana Ross proved that she would fight the very heavens to remain the focus of the lens. But as the camera zoomed in on her rain-streaked face, the viewer is forced to wonder, who is left to see her? The sisters were gone, the founder was dead, and the man who created her was watching from the wings. She had achieved the selection, she had survived the grooming, and she had executed the divide and conquer. She stood alone in the center of the world, exactly where Berry Gordy told her she belonged, oblivious to the fact that the spotlight had become her only companion. As the neon lights of the 20th century began to fade into the digital coldness of the 21st, the woman who had once been the solitary son of Motown found herself navigating a landscape of echoes. To look at Diana Ross in the decades following 1983 is to witness the final agonizing stage of the selection, a phase where the star has outlived the empire, the architect, and the rivals, leaving only the ghost of a brand to wander the halls of a hollowed-out legacy. This final act is not a progression, but a recursive loop, a haunting demonstration that once a soul is reconfigured for absolute dominance, it loses the capacity to ever return to the simplicity of the sisterhood. The most profound mirror of Diana's internal isolation was found in her relationship with Michael Jackson. In the 1970s and 80s, the world saw them as a glamorous pair, the queen and her prince. But beneath the surface, they were two products of the same assembly line, sharing a trauma that no one else could comprehend. Diana was more than a mentor to Michael. She was his prototype. She was the proof that the Motown factory could take a child of the projects and turn them into a celestial body. But as Michael ascended into his own imperial loneliness, he became a grotesque reflection of Diana's own grooming. He watched how she commanded a room, how she prioritized the lens over the person, and how she used glamour as a bulletproof vest. When Michael looked at Diana, he saw the only person who understood what it meant to trade a human childhood for a corporate immortality. Their bond was a trauma bond of the highest order, two stars locked in an orbit of mutual recognition, yet both so conditioned for isolation that they could never truly reach out and save one another from the void. This loop of history repeated itself with a devastating clinical precision in the year 2000, during the ill-fated Return to Love tour. It was meant to be the ultimate reconciliation, the moment the surviving Supremes would finally close the circle. But the machinery of 1967 was still humming in the background, as efficient as ever. Diana Ross, now a legend of nearly 4 decades, entered the negotiations not as a sister seeking a reunion, but as a CEO managing an asset. She offered Mary Wilson a fraction of the tour's profits, maintaining the rigid ampersand that Berry Gordy had built decades prior. The message was clear. There were no Supremes. There was only Diana Ross and the employees she chose to stand behind her. When Mary Wilson refused to be treated as a background singer in her own life story, the tour went ahead with replacement singers who had never even met Florence Ballard. The resulting failure was a public confirmation of the internal rot. The ampersand had become a permanent wall. Even in her 50s, with nothing left to prove and millions in the bank, Diana Ross could not, or would not, dismantle the hierarchy. The Gordy reflex was a terminal condition. In her later years, the image of Diana Ross has become a study in the aesthetic of the void. She continues to tour, a vision in massive clouds of tulle and shimmering sequins, her voice still carrying that aerodynamic frequency that conquered the world. But the stage has become a desert. When she stands in the center of the spotlight today, she is surrounded by session musicians and backup vocalists whose names the audience will never know. There is no one on stage who remembers the cold Detroit winters or the smell of the Brewster-Douglass hallways. She has achieved the ultimate goal of the grooming process. She is entirely, perfectly alone. The selection is complete. She is the only survivor of the original vision, a museum piece of a vanished era, performing the illusion of joy for audiences who see the silk but never the blood on the parchment. The tragedy of this endless loop is that for Diana to remain the star, the narrative of the sisterhood must remain suppressed. Every honor she receives, every Lifetime Achievement Award, is a silent erasure of the girl who stood under a bedroom lamp, sewing the very first costumes. The world celebrates the pioneer, but the pioneer is a woman who had to burn the map and the people who helped her draw it, just to ensure no one could follow her to the throne. Her current solitude is not a mistake. It is the logical conclusion of a business model that prioritized the brand over the soul. As the story reaches its end, the narrative must inevitably collapse back in on itself, retreating from the world stages and the Hollywood red carpets, traveling backward through the decades, past the Motown 25 shove, past the neon gallows of the Flamingo Hotel, and past the secret births and the legal blacklists. The film ends where it began, in the gray, unforgiving concrete of the Brewster-Douglass housing projects in 1959. We see three young girls, Diane, Florence, and Mary, leaning against a brick wall. They are laughing, their voices blending in a raw, unpolished harmony that doesn't need a mixing board or a CEO to validate its worth. In this moment, before the selection, before the grooming, and before the divide and conquer, they were already whole. They didn't need to be the one because they were the three. The haunting tragedy is that the world convinced them that the gray concrete was a predator they had to fight, when in reality the only thing that could truly protect them was the very sisterhood they were taught to dismantle. The screen fades to black on the image of those three girls, their dreams still innocent, their seams still straight, and their voices still unified. A perfect, haunting circle that proves the darkest part of the Diana Ross story isn't what she gained, but the absolute irreversible loss of the girl she was before the machine told her she was a queen